I never believed in God until the night I heard a voice that wasn't human beg me for mercy in a language I shouldn't have understood. I was a military contractor, pulling night security at a facility that officially didn't exist, 300 feet beneath the Nevada desert, where the fluorescent lights hummed their sterile hymn and the air tasted like recycled fear. My job was simple: walk the corridors, check the biometric locks, report anything unusual, and above all, never ask questions about what happened behind the doors marked with red clearance symbols. For 2 years, I kept my head down, cashed my checks, and told myself that ignorance was a fair price for the kind of money that could erase a man's past. But that night, during my 2 a.m. rounds through Sector 7, something shattered the monotony of my comfortable blindness. It started as a whisper at the edge of my consciousness, so faint I thought it was the ventilation system or the settling of concrete under impossible weight. Then it grew stronger, clearer, wrapping around my thoughts like silk, and I realized with a cold shock that ran down my spine that the voice wasn't coming through my ears at all. It was inside my mind, speaking directly to the part of me that still remembered how to pray. Even though I'd stopped years ago, the words were desperate, gentle, and impossibly calm all at once. Please do not be afraid. I mean you no harm. I only ask that you listen. I froze in the middle of the corridor, my hand instinctively moving to the sidearm I'd never had to draw, my heart hammering against my ribs like a prisoner begging for release. Every rational part of my brain screamed at me to call it in, to report a possible psychological break, to run back to the guard station and pretend I'd heard nothing. But there was something in that voice that stopped me, something that felt less like a threat and more like a confession, as if whoever was speaking had been waiting lifetimes for someone to finally hear them. I stood there, surrounded by concrete and steel and secrets, and felt the weight of a choice I didn't yet understand pressing down on my shoulders. The voice came again, softer this time, tinged with what I can only describe as sorrow. I know you feel it, the wrongness of this place. I know you've wondered what lies behind the doors you're told never to open, and God help me, I had wondered. I'd heard the strange sounds echoing through the ventilation shafts at night, seen the scientists emerge from restricted wings with haunted eyes and trembling hands, watched unmarked trucks arrive before dawn carrying cargo that moved beneath the tarps. I'd told myself 1,000 times that it wasn't my business, that survival meant staying ignorant, but the voice in my head was offering me something I'd spent years running from, the truth. My feet began moving before my mind could catch up, carrying me away from my designated patrol route and toward the heavy security door at the end of the corridor that I'd passed 100 times without ever seeing opened. The voice guided me, not with words but with a pull I felt in my chest, as if an invisible thread connected my heart to whatever waited on the other side of that door. I used my override keycard, my hands shaking, half expecting alarms to scream and armed guards to flood the hallway, but the lock disengaged with a soft click that sounded like destiny. The door swung open on hydraulic hinges, revealing a stairwell that descended into deeper darkness, and I began to walk down, each step taking me further from the life I knew and closer to a reality I couldn't yet comprehend. The air grew colder as I descended, and I could feel the presence growing stronger, a weight in my mind that felt both ancient and oddly familiar, like remembering a dream from childhood. At the bottom of the stairs, another door waited, this one marked with symbols I didn't recognize, and when I placed my hand on the cold metal, I felt something I hadn't experienced since I was a boy in Sunday school, the electric certainty that I was standing at the threshold of something sacred and terrible. When the final door opened and the sterile light of the containment cell spilled out into the darkness, where I stood, I saw him for the first time, and every assumption I'd ever made about the nature of reality shattered like glass. He was enormous, easily 8 feet tall even in his weakened state, his scaled skin shimmering with iridescent patterns that seemed to shift between deep emerald and burnished gold in the harsh fluorescent glare. His eyes found mine immediately, and they were nothing like the cold reptilian stare I'd expected. They were golden and deep and filled with an intelligence and sadness that looked disturbingly human. Heavy titanium restraints bound his arms and legs to the wall, and I could see where they'd cut into his flesh, dark blood dried in patterns that spoke of months, maybe years, of captivity. But what struck me most, what made my knees weak and forced me to grip the doorframe for support, was the expression on that alien face. It was hope, mixed with shame, mixed with a desperate gratitude that I'd actually come He spoke then, not with his mouth but with that same voice in my mind, and it carried the weight of confession. My name is Azareth, I am Draco, and I need your help to prevent an atrocity that your world cannot yet imagine. I stepped fully into the containment cell, the door sliding shut behind me with a pneumatic hiss that sounded like a tomb ceiling, and I realized with crystalline clarity that I'd just crossed a line from which there could be no return. The air in the room was thick with the smell of antiseptic and something else, something organic and ancient, like earth after rain mixed with incense from a church I'd forgotten I ever attended. Azareth watched me with those impossible golden eyes, and I could feel him in my mind, not invading but waiting at the threshold of my thoughts like a guest who wouldn't enter without permission. My hand still rested on my sidearm, though some deeper part of me already knew I wouldn't need it, that whatever threat this being might pose to the world, he posed none to me in this moment. He shifted slightly, and the chains binding him rattled with a sound that echoed off the concrete walls, and I saw him wince, not just from physical pain but from something deeper, something that looked like shame. You're afraid, his voice whispered through my consciousness, gentle as a father speaking to a frightened child. And you should be, but not of me. I am a prisoner here because I refuse to continue the work my kind has done in the shadows of your world for longer than your recorded history. I am what your ancient texts called a serpent, a dragon, one of the fallen who chose pride over love. But I am also something my brothers believe impossible. I am repentant. The word hit me like a physical force, and suddenly I was 8 years old again, sitting in a wooden pew next to my grandmother, listening to Pastor Richard's talk about redemption and the infinite reach of God's grace. How no soul was too lost to be found if it genuinely sought forgiveness. I'd walked away from all that years ago, buried it under cynicism and disappointment and the comfortable numbness of a life lived for money rather than meaning. But standing in that cell with the chained reptilian being who spoke of repentance, I felt those old foundations stirring beneath the rubble I'd piled on top of them. What do you mean? Your kind, I managed to say aloud, my voice sounding small and strange after the intimate silence of mental communication. Azareth closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, I saw tears forming in their golden depths, actual tears that caught the fluorescent light like liquid amber. We are the Draco, he said, and this time I heard both his mental voice and a physical sound, a deep resonance that came from his chest and vibrated in my bones. And we have been here since before your civilization learned to write our presence into your myths. We are the serpents in your gardens, the dragons in your legends, the reptilian shadows that your conspiracy theorists sense but cannot prove. We came to Earth as conquerors, but we found something here that changed the equation of power, something that terrified us and fascinated us in equal measure. We found you, bearers of the divine spark, that we rejected so long ago that we'd forgotten what it felt like to burn with that holy fire. He leaned forward as much as his restraints would allow, and the intensity in his gaze made me take an involuntary step back, not from fear but from the sheer weight of what I saw: their conviction, urgency, and something that looked disturbingly like love. My people have infiltrated the highest levels of your governments, your militaries, your financial systems, your religious institutions, Azareth continued, his mental voice taking on the cadence of confession, words that had been held inside for too long finally pouring out. We did this not through force but through deception, breeding hybrid bloodlines that could walk among you undetected, whispering in the ears of those who craved power above all else, feeding the very worst impulses of humanity, while harvesting the very best of what you are. And I participated in this. For centuries I played my role in the machinery of control, until I was assigned to oversee a facility much like this one, where we kept human subjects for a project we called the Harvest. I expected to find cattle, beings whose consciousness could be extracted and repurposed without moral consequence. But instead I found something that shattered every assumption I'd built my existence upon. I found souls that shone with a light my kind had not seen since before our own fall from grace, and I understood for the first time why the Creator had loved you enough to walk among you in flesh, to die for you, to offer you the path back to paradise that we had permanently abandoned. I felt my legs give out, and I slid down the wall until I was sitting on the cold concrete floor, my mind struggling to process what I was hearing, to reconcile the impossible being before me with words like Creator and divine spark and fall from grace. Are you telling me? I said slowly, each word carefully chosen because I knew that what I said next would define everything that followed, that you believe in God, That's something like you. Something that looks like it crawled out of humanity's darkest nightmares. Believes in Jesus Christ. The Zareth's expression shifted into something I can only describe as radiant sorrow, and he nodded with a gesture that looked painfully human. I did not believe, he said, his voice breaking with emotion that transcended species, until I watched a human prisoner, a young woman scheduled for the harvest, pray for the salvation of her captors even as we prepared to strip her consciousness from her body. She looked at me with eyes that held no hatred, only pity and love, and she said that Jesus had died for all beings who would accept his grace, that no soul was beyond redemption if it genuinely sought forgiveness. And in that moment, I felt the presence of the Creator for the first time in millennia, felt his love pouring through this fragile human vessel, and I knew with absolute certainty that everything my kind had built was a rebellion against the only truth that mattered, that God is love, and that love is the most powerful force in all the cosmos, more powerful than all our technology and manipulation and ancient pride combined. I sat there on that cold floor staring at this being who should not exist, who had just spoken the name of Jesus with a reverence that put my own forgotten faith to shame, and I felt something breaking open inside my chest like a dam that had been holding back years of carefully maintained disbelief. The rational part of my mind, the part that had been trained in military protocol and empirical evidence, screamed that this was impossible, that I was experiencing some kind of psychological break or environmental contamination. But that voice grew quieter with each passing moment as something deeper and older stirred within me, something that recognized truth even when it came wrapped in scales and chains. As Zareth watched me, with those golden eyes that seemed to see not just my face but the entire landscape of my soul, all the disappointments and compromises and moments when I'd chosen comfort over courage. And yet there was no judgment in that gaze, only a profound understanding born from his own journey through darkness toward light. I found myself thinking about my grandmother again, how she used to say that God's grace was like rain that fell on everyone, regardless of whether they deserved it. How she believed that the Creator's love was so vast and unconditional, that it could reach into the deepest pit and pull out anyone who genuinely reached back. I'd thought those were just pretty words meant to comfort simple people who needed easy answers, but sitting in that containment cell with a repentant reptilian being, I began to understand that maybe the truth was far stranger and more beautiful than any comfort I'd ever imagined. Tell me about the harvest, I said finally, my voice steadier now, though my hands still trembled where they rested on my knees, and I saw something flash across Azareth's face, a shadow of pain so deep it seemed to age him before my eyes. He drew in a long breath that rattled in his chest, and when he spoke again his mental voice carried images with it, visions that bloomed in my mind with terrible clarity. Vast underground facilities filled with cylindrical tanks, human bodies floating in luminescent fluid, their eyes moving rapidly beneath closed lids as if they were dreaming, while overhead grotesque machinery hummed with purpose I couldn't quite grasp. We discovered long ago that consciousness is not bound to biology, as Zareth explained, and I could feel the weight of his guilt pressing against my thoughts like a physical presence, that the soul, that divine spark the Creator placed within humanity, could be extracted and transferred into other vessels, bioengineered forms designed for specific purposes. My people have been conducting this harvest for generations, identifying humans with particularly strong wills, powerful faith, exceptional courage, and taking them under the cover of what your society dismisses as alien abductions or missing persons cases that go forever unsolved. We transfer their consciousness into enhanced bodies, hybrid forms that combine human adaptability with Draco engineering, and we use them as soldiers in conflicts that span star systems you don't have names for, wars fought over resources and territories and ancient grudges that predate your species' existence. But we found something we did not expect, even when stripped from their original bodies, even when placed in forms designed for combat and obedience. The human soul retains its connection to the divine, and that connection makes them far more effective than any soldier my kind could ever produce. A human who fights with faith, who carries the certainty of God's love even into the darkness between stars, becomes something we cannot fully control, something that frightens the ancient powers who have ruled the cosmos for eons. I pushed myself up from the floor, my legs unsteady but holding, and I walked closer to him until I stood just beyond the reach of those chained claws, close enough to see the texture of his scales, the way they caught the light like dark emeralds. close enough to smell that strange mixture of earth and incense that surrounded him like an aura. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, and even as the words left my mouth I knew the answer, could feel it forming in the space between us like something being born, fragile and crucial and weighted with destiny. Azareth lifted his head, and despite the chains and the weakness I could see in the tremor of his limbs, he looked suddenly regal, like ancient royalty remembering what it meant to stand for something greater than survival. "Because I cannot stop the harvest alone," he said simply, his voice resonating with both humility and fierce determination. "Because my people have labeled me a traitor and imprisoned me in this facility, where they conduct their own version of the work I refused to continue. And because when I prayed for the first time in my existence, when I asked the Creator to show me what I should do with this strange new awareness of right and wrong, I received an answer that led me to you. You carry something I lost so long ago I barely remember what it felt like. You carry free will unspoiled by eons of pride, and you carry the capacity to choose love over fear, truth over comfort, sacrifice over safety. The young woman who saved my soul with her prayers told me that Jesus taught his followers that the truth would set them free, and I am offering you truth that will shatter the comfortable prison of ignorance, but might also ignite in you the same fire that brought me back from spiritual death." I reached out without thinking, my hand moving toward him of its own accord, and when my palm rested against the scales of his forearm I felt a current pass between us. Not electricity but something deeper, a recognition that transcended species and circumstance, the acknowledgement that we were both creatures struggling toward light from our respective darknesses. In that moment of contact I understood that this was the ultimate betrayal, from the perspective of his kind, that by refusing to participate in a harvest he had rejected not just a project, but an entire worldview built on the assumption that might made right, that advanced technology granted moral superiority, that beings without the divine spark could do as they pleased with those who carried it. My people believe that humanity's connection to the Creator is a resource to be exploited, Azareth continued, and I could feel tears on my own face now though I couldn't remember starting to cry. But I have come to understand that it is actually a gift offered to all beings, a path back to grace that remains open no matter how far we have fallen or how long we have walked in rebellion. The human woman who prayed for me showed me that God's love is not limited by biology or history, or the magnitude of our sins, that the same Jesus who died for humanity's redemption died for all conscious beings who would accept that sacrifice, and that the cosmic war being fought in shadows and in the spaces between worlds is ultimately a battle for souls, not territory, and I have chosen my side, knowing it will cost me everything, knowing that my own kind will hunt me until the end of my days, because I finally understand what the Creator understood when he made beings with free will, that love only means something when we have the capacity to choose its opposite, and that redemption only has value when we genuinely needed saving. I made the decision in my heart, before my mind could catch up, that ancient instinct that my grandmother used to call the voice of God whispering through our better angels, and I was moving then, my hands reaching for the control panel beside the containment cell, while Azareth watched me with an expression I can only describe as profound hope, mixed with sorrowful understanding. My fingers flew across the keypad, entering override codes I shouldn't have known but somehow did, as if the same force that had led me to this moment was guiding my actions with invisible hands. And when the energy field flickered and died with a sound like breaking glass, when those heavy chains fell away from his scaled limbs with metallic crashes that echoed through the corridor, I understood that I had just crossed a line from which there would be no return. Azareth rose, slowly, unfolding his massive frame until he towered over me, easily 8 feet of reptilian muscle and ancient presence. Yet I felt no fear, only an overwhelming sense of rightness that seemed to silence every alarm my survival instincts were desperately trying to sound. We stood there for a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, human and Draco, prisoner and liberator, two souls who had found each other across the vast improbability of species and circumstance. And then the facility's alarms erupted into screaming life, red lights strobing through the corridor, like the pulse of some massive mechanical heart realizing it had been wounded. We ran through those sterile passages, my boots pounding against polished floors while Azareth moved with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for something so large, his clawed feet making whisper-soft contacts that spoke of predatory evolution, perfected over millions of years. Behind us I could hear the thunder of response teams mobilizing, the shouting of security personnel whose voices carried that particular edge. If panic that comes when the impossible crashes through the walls of carefully maintained denial. And I knew with absolute certainty that if they caught us, I would disappear into the same system of silence and classified oblivion that had swallowed so many others who stumbled onto truths too dangerous for public consumption. Azareth led us through corridors I had never seen despite months of working in this facility, service tunnels that branched off into darkness like the veins of some enormous buried creature. And as we descended deeper into the earth, I felt the temperature drop and the air grow thick with moisture and ancient mineral smells. Then he stopped suddenly in a maintenance junction where pipes climbed the walls like metallic vines, and before I could ask why, he turned to me and placed his massive clawed hand against my chest, right over my heart, and the world exploded into vision. I saw things my mind had no framework to process, images that bypassed my eyes entirely and burned themselves directly into my consciousness with the intensity of lightning striking flesh. I saw human soldiers in armor that looked both familiar and alien, their faces visible through transparent visors, and in their eyes, I recognized something that made my soul recoil in horror because those eyes were empty, not physically but spiritually, as if something essential had been hollowed out and replaced with mere function. I watched them fight on worlds where the sky was the wrong color, where multiple suns cast shadows in directions that violated geometry, where they moved with perfect coordination and absolute obedience, conducting wars whose purposes they could not question because the part of them that questioned had been carefully excised or suppressed. I saw the facilities where this transformation happened, witnessed the moment when consciousness was pulled from one vessel and inserted into another, saw the terrible efficiency of machinery designed to harvest the most precious thing a human possessed, that divine spark Azareth spoke of, that connection to the Creator that made us more than just sophisticated biological machines, and threaded through all these visions like a golden cord running through darkness. I saw moments of resistance, a soldier pausing in the middle of battle to help a wounded enemy, another refusing a direct order because something deep within recognized it as fundamentally wrong, and in each instance I witnessed a brief flare of light, as if their souls were fighting to remember what they had been, who they had been, before they were stolen and repurposed for wars they never chose. When the visions released me, I collapsed against the tunnel wall, my body shaking so violently I could barely stand, tears streaming down my face as I gasped for air like a drowning man breaking the surface. Azareth steadied me with surprising gentleness, his clawed hand on my shoulder providing an anchor point, while my mind struggled to reconcile what I had seen with everything I thought I knew about reality, about the limits of technology, about the fundamental nature of human existence and the soul's relationship to the body that housed it. The sounds of pursuit were growing closer, voices and footsteps echoing through the tunnels, with the inevitability of a closing trap. But in that moment all I could think about was those hollow eyes, those stolen souls fighting wars in the darkness between stars, while the rest of humanity slept in comfortable ignorance beneath skies we thought we understood. Azareth's mental voice was gentle when it touched my thoughts again, carrying with it a compassion born from his own journey through horror toward understanding. Now, you see what I refused to continue, why I chose betrayal of my kind over betrayal of the divine purpose I had finally recognized. And now you must choose whether this knowledge will paralyze you with despair, or ignite in you the same fire that burns in every human soul that has ever stood against darkness and declared that love is stronger than fear, that truth matters more than comfort, and that the Creator's plan for humanity is far greater and stranger than any of us imagined. We emerged from those tunnels into a landscape that seemed impossible, a hidden cavern so vast my flashlight beam disappeared into darkness, before finding the opposite wall. And in that subterranean cathedral carved by water and time over epochs beyond human reckoning, Azareth finally stopped running and turned to face me with an expression that carried the weight of millennia. The ceiling arched overhead like the roof of some ancient temple, stalactites hanging down like the fingers of stone gods reaching toward their mirror images rising from the floor, and in the center of this natural sanctuary stood formations that looked almost deliberate, as if geology and intention had conspired to create an altar for confessions that would shatter worlds. He gestured for me to sit on a smooth boulder worn comfortable by vanished waters, and as I lowered myself onto that stone seat with legs still trembling from exertion and revelation, I watched this massive reptilian being position himself before me with something approaching reverence, as if what he was about to share required a posture of humility before both God and the human. He was about to trust with terrible truths. The air in that cavern tasted of minerals and deep earth, carried the kind of profound silence that exists only in places where human voices rarely penetrate, and in that quietness broken only by the distant drip of water finding its patient way through stone. Azareth began to speak aloud for the first time, his voice a rumbling bass that resonated in my chest and carried harmonics that seemed to touch something primal in my nervous system. For thousands of your years, my kind have walked among you, wearing faces you would recognize as human, occupying positions of influence and power, guiding your civilizations along pathways that served our purposes rather than your divine destiny, he said, and each word felt like a hammer blow against the foundations of history as I understood it, cracking open assumptions about free will and human agency that I had never thought to question. We conducted what we called the Harvest, a program of consciousness extraction and transfer that your science does not yet admit is possible, though your military and intelligence agencies have been experimenting with similar technologies and facilities exactly like the one you worked in, often with our guidance, always with our ultimate goals in mind. He moved closer, his golden eyes catching the beam of my flashlight and reflecting it back with an intensity that made them seem to glow from within, and I found myself unable to look away, held captive not by fear, but by the magnetic pull of truth finally being spoken after lifetimes of carefully maintained lies. We would identify humans of particular consciousness quality, those whose souls burned brightest with what we clinically termed bioelectric potential, but what your mystics and prophets would recognize as the Holy Spirit's presence, and we would take them, extract their consciousness from the bodies you know and insert them into bioengineered vessels designed for combat, for exploration, for tasks in environments and conflicts your species has no knowledge of, because the war we fight spans dimensions your physics cannot yet measure. The horror of it washed over me again, but now with additional details that made it more concrete and therefore more unbearable. The thought of someone living an ordinary life, going to work or kissing their children goodnight, then simply disappearing, their body perhaps found with some mundane explanation for death while their consciousness, their very soul, was enslaved in flesh not their own, fighting wars for purposes they could neither understand nor refuse. But here is what we discovered too late. What our scientists and priests alike failed to understand until some of us, rebels like myself, finally opened our eyes to see what should have been obvious from the beginning. Azareth continued, and now his voice carried something I had not heard before, a trembling quality that spoke of emotion barely contained, of revelation that had cost him everything he once was. Human consciousness is not like ours, not like any of the dozens of species we have encountered across galaxies and dimensional barriers. Because woven into the very structure of your souls is something we lost so long ago we had forgotten it ever existed, the divine spark, the direct connection to the Creator that your scriptures speak of when they say you are made in God's image, not physically but spiritually, carriers of a creative force that can literally reshape reality through will powered by faith and love. He reached out and touched a stalactite, his claw tracing its length as if reading history written in stone, and when he spoke again, his mental voice joined his spoken words, creating a stereo effect that bypassed my ears and resonated directly in my mind and heart simultaneously. When we transfer human consciousness into our engineered bodies, something extraordinary happens that our scientists cannot prevent and your military handlers try desperately to suppress. The divine spark remains active, and soldiers who should be perfectly obedient. When Azareth spoke those words about the divine spark, I felt something shift in the very air around us, as if the cavern itself was holding its breath in anticipation of what would come next. And he moved with sudden urgency to the center of that stone cathedral where water had carved a natural basin into the floor, its surface still holding a mirror of dark water that reflected nothing, but waited like a scrying pool for revelation. He gestured for me to approach, and though every tactical instinct the first possessed screamed warnings about leaving my defensive position, I found myself walking forward, as if drawn by invisible threads, my boots echoing on stone that had known only silence for countless ages. Before this moment of terrible unveiling, when I reached the edge of that basin and looked down into water so still it seemed more like polished obsidian than liquid, Azareth placed his clawed hand on my shoulder with surprising gentleness, and I felt heat radiating through my jacket, through skin and muscle, penetrating down to something deeper than bone. touching the part of me that dreamed and hoped and secretly believed in more than the material world despite all my training in cynicism and tactical reality. What I am about to show you, the reason my people fear human consciousness above all other forces in this cosmos, requires you to see not with your eyes but with the understanding that lies dormant in every human soul, waiting for awakening, he said, his mental voice now blending seamlessly with spoken words until I could not distinguish between sound entering my ears and thoughts appearing fully formed in my mind. The water in the basin began to glow with soft luminescence that came from no external source, rising from within its depths as if the stone itself was remembering ancient light, and in that glow I saw images forming, not quite reflections and not quite visions, existing in that liminal space between perception and knowing where truth bypasses skepticism to write itself directly onto consciousness. I saw human soldiers, but not as I had seen them in Azarath's earlier vision, not hollow-eyed and enslaved, but rather transformed in a way that defied the intentions of their captors, their bioengineered bodies radiating something that looked like flames but felt like love, moving through alien battlefields not with the cold efficiency of programmed weapons, but with purpose that seemed to bend probability itself around their presence. These warriors prayed even as they fought, whispered words to God while surrounded by technologies and beings that should have made faith impossible, and where their prayers touched the fabric of reality I saw ripples spreading outward like stones dropped in cosmic ponds, disrupting systems and confusing artificial intelligences, and causing machinery designed by civilizations millions of years advanced beyond Earth to simply stop functioning as if encountering a force their creators had never imagined needing to account for. Do you see? Azarath asked, his voice thick with something between wonder and grief, the tone of someone describing a beauty they could observe but never possess, admiring a sunrise through glass that forever separated them from its warmth. The divine spark that your creator placed within human souls is not metaphorical or symbolic as my people's scientists first assumed when they began studying your species, treating your religious texts as primitive mythology and your faith as evolutionary psychology, comfortable delusions that helped pre-technological civilizations cope with mortality and chaos. He knelt beside me, his massive frame folding with articulated grace, bringing his golden eyes level with mine so I could see galaxies reflected in their depths, or perhaps see through them to galaxies beyond. It is literal, actual, measurable power that operates on principles our physics cannot explain because it originates from outside the created universe itself, flowing from the creator into beings made deliberately vulnerable, deliberately mortal, deliberately free in ways that no other conscious species was designed to be, because only in that freedom, that terrible, dangerous freedom to choose love over survival, sacrifice over self-preservation, could the divine spark actually ignite and burn with the intensity that makes human souls capable of altering the fundamental constants that govern material existence. The images in the water shifted and I saw what looked like a prison cell on some distant world under alien stars, and in that cell a human woman knelt with hands clasped in prayer while around her reptilian guards watched with expressions I now recognized as confusion mixed with something approaching fear. And as she prayed I saw light beginning to emanate from her physical form, not metaphorical light, but actual photons streaming from her skin in patterns that made the guards step backward and caused monitoring equipment to spark and fail. She was praying not for rescue or revenge but for her captors, asking God to open their eyes, as hers had been opened, to help them remember what they had forgotten, to bring them home to the love they had abandoned in their pursuit of evolution beyond emotion and transcendence through technology rather than grace. And as those words left her lips in a language she had probably spoken in Sunday school or church services back on Earth, I saw one of the guards fall to his knees, his reptilian features contorting not in pain but in the agony of something long dead, suddenly resurrecting inside a chest that had not held a beating heart of conscience for millennia of calculated cruelty. That was the moment everything changed for me, Azarath said, and now his voice broke completely. The sophisticated translator or telepathic link or whatever technology or ability allowed our communication fracturing under the weight of emotion too large for any language to contain. I was that guard, standing in that cell, watching this fragile human female prisoner who by all logic should have been cursing us or begging for mercy, and instead she was loving us, actually loving us with a love that did not originate in her own capacity for compassion, but flowed through her from a source I thought my people had proven did not exist. through our mastery of physics and our conquest of death itself. And in that moment when her prayer touched me, I felt what I had not felt since before. Our species chose the path of pure intellect over messy emotion, before we engineered away our capacity for what we called weakness. But what I suddenly understood was the very thing that made existence meaningful rather than just endless. The light in the basin faded, but the images remained burned into my consciousness with the permanence of truth that can never be unseen or forgotten. And as Zareth rose to his full height, looking up through the darkness toward a ceiling we could not see, but which separated us from the desert surface, and beyond that the stars, where even now the war he described was being fought with human souls as both weapons and prizes, your Jesus, the one your scriptures call the Word made flesh, was not mythology or allegory, but a demonstration in terms you could witness and remember, showing that the divine spark within humanity was not diminished, but rather fully expressed when connected completely to its source, performing what you call miracles, but what are actually glimpses of reality operating under the principles of love rather than entropy, creation rather than decay, resurrection rather than mere survival, he said. And these words carried such reverence that I knew whatever else he was, whatever crimes his species had committed, in this moment he was speaking truth that cost him everything to acknowledge. My people fear this, above all else, that humans awakening to their true nature and purpose would render our technologies and our carefully constructed power structures as meaningless as sand castles before the tide, because faith powered by love and directed by will aligned with the Creator's intention does not just move mountains as your scriptures promise, but reshapes the very laws we thought were immutable, proves that consciousness precedes and supersedes matter, that the spiritual realm your secularists dismiss is actually more fundamental than the physical dimensions we have spent eons mapping and conquering. He looked at me then with such intensity I felt seen in ways that went beyond visual observation, perceived in the totality of my being with all its contradictions and doubts and secret hopes. I had never spoken aloud, and in his eyes I saw reflected not just myself, but the potential of what humanity could become if we truly understood the gift we carried within every human heart, beating out its rhythm of desperate hope against the silence of a universe we had been told was empty of meaning or purpose or love. I watched as Azareth's massive form seemed to collapse inward, not physically, but emotionally, as if the weight of his confession was finally breaking through defenses he had maintained for longer than my civilization had existed, and he lowered himself to the stone floor with his back against the cavern wall, his clawed hands covering his face in a gesture so profoundly human that for a moment I forgot entirely what he was and saw only a soul in the grip of transformative grief. The golden light from his eyes leaked through his fingers, like tears made of luminescence, casting dancing shadows on the ancient rock, and when he finally spoke again, his voice had lost all its alien otherness, becoming simply the sound of someone confessing sins so enormous that language itself seemed inadequate to contain their weight. I stood in that cell watching her pray, this human female whose name was Sarah, and who had been taken from her home during what your military calls an abduction, but what is actually systematic harvesting, and I had overseen thousands of such acquisitions, without ever considering the consciousness behind the eyes that looked at me with terror, or defiance, or sometimes heartbreaking hope that this was somehow not what it appeared to be. He said, and I heard in those words the echo of every perpetrator who suddenly sees their victims as fully human, as deserving of the empathy they had systematically denied in order to continue their function within systems of cruelty. He lowered his hands and looked at me with eyes that held millennia of accumulated shame now finally acknowledged, and I found myself moving closer despite every tactical consideration, sitting on the cold stone beside this being who should have been my enemy, but who in this moment was simply another conscious entity wrestling with the terrible gift of moral awakening. She prayed for me by name even though I had never spoken it in her presence, called me Azareth, and asked her God to help me remember what I truly was beneath the conditioning and the cultural evolution that had turned my species into efficient predators. And the specificity of that prayer, the intimate knowing in her words, made it impossible to dismiss as random neurons firing in a stressed biological system the way our scientists had taught us to interpret human religious experience. The cavern seemed to grow colder around us as he continued, or perhaps I was simply feeling the chill of understanding something too large for comfort, too true for the convenient categories I had used to organize reality into manageable compartments. where aliens were simply advanced technology users and faith was private comfort, rather than actual force capable of reaching across species and evolutionary paths to wake the dead places in a soul. When her prayer touched me, I felt something I can only describe as remembering, not accessing stored data or retrieving information from genetic memory, but remembering in the way you might suddenly recall your own childhood after years of deliberate forgetting. That sudden flood of recognition that you were once something other than what you have become. That innocence preceded calculation, and love came before the decision to armor yourself against it, because it made you vulnerable in a universe you had been taught was fundamentally hostile, Azareth said, his clawed hand now resting on his chest over where I assumed his heart would be, if his species still possessed such organs in their original emotional function. I saw his scaled skin rippling, as if something beneath was moving, trying to break through barriers biological and psychological, and his breathing became labored in a way that suggested he was feeling, rather than just describing this memory, reliving the moment that had shattered his carefully constructed identity. I felt the presence of her God, your God, the creator my people had declared was primitive superstition after we achieved interstellar travel and mastered genetic engineering and conquered death itself through consciousness transfer and cloning. And that presence was not the distant watchmaker, or the vengeful tyrant, or the impersonal force that philosophers debate, but rather something so intimate and so knowing that every wall I had built around the core of my being simply dissolved like shadows in sudden light. His voice broke completely then, becoming a sound I had never heard from any throat, human or otherwise, the sound of someone weeping who had forgotten how to weep, grief forcing itself through channels long closed. And I found my own eyes burning with tears I did not fully understand, crying for this broken creature beside me, crying for the human woman whose prayer had been powerful enough to crack open a consciousness sealed shut by millennia of deliberate evolution away from vulnerability. He composed himself slowly, scales settling back into place, breathing becoming more regular, but something fundamental had changed in his posture and presence, as if the confession had released tension he had been carrying across light years and decades of exile from his own kind. In that moment of contact with the divine presence flowing through Sarah's prayer, I understood with absolute clarity that everything my civilization had built was constructed on a foundation of deliberate blindness, that we had chosen power over love not because love was weakness, but because love required surrender of control, acknowledgement that we were not the supreme intelligences in a mechanical universe, but rather children who had run away from home and convinced ourselves we were orphans, rather than face the implications of having a father who loved us despite our rebellion, Azareth said. And these words carried such theological precision that I wondered if his species had once possessed their own scriptures, their own prophets, their own chance at redemption before they chose the path of pure intellect, divorced from the messy complications of grace and mercy and unearned love. I thought of every sermon I had ignored or dismissed in my own life, every moment I had chosen comfortable cynicism over dangerous faith, and I realized that the distance between human and Draco was not as vast as it appeared, that we were all capable of engineering away our capacity for the very things that made existence more than just complex chemistry and inevitable entropy. Sarah looked at me with such compassion after I fell to my knees before her, reached through the energy barrier that should have burned her hand and touched my face, and said that God loved me and had been waiting for me to remember that love is not the opposite of strength, but the source of it, that the armor I wore both physically and psychologically was not protecting me but imprisoning me in a small version of what I was created to be, he continued, and I saw in the way he touched his own face that he was tracing where her hand had rested, holding the memory like a talisman against the darkness that had defined his existence before and after that transformative encounter. The weight of his revelation settled over me like a physical presence, and I understood finally why he had risked everything to defect, why he was here in this cavern confessing to a human security contractor, instead of continuing his work within the systems that had shaped him. Because once you have been touched by love that originates from beyond yourself, from beyond even the created universe itself, returning to comfortable cruelty becomes impossible, no matter what the cost of your new allegiance to truth and light, and the God who refuses to abandon even those who have spent millennia running from his presence. I sat there beside Azareth in the cold stone silence of the cavern, my mind reeling from everything he had confessed, when he suddenly gripped my shoulder with surprising gentleness for claws that could tear through steel. and his golden eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made me feel as though he was looking not just at me but through me, into the essence of what I was and what humanity itself represented in a cosmos far more crowded and conflicted than I had ever imagined. You must understand that what is coming to Earth is not simply an invasion or a political annexation, or even a harvesting operation on a larger scale, he said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper that somehow filled the entire space around us with its gravity and urgency. There is a war that has been raging since before your species took its first breath. A conflict so vast and so fundamental that it makes your world wars look like children's disputes over toys. And this war is not primarily about territory or resources or even survival, but about something far more precious and far more dangerous: the allegiance of beings who still carry within them the undiluted image of the Creator, the divine spark that most ancient races have either lost or deliberately extinguished in their pursuit of technological godhood. I felt my heart hammering against my ribs as the implications of his words began cascading through my understanding, reshaping everything I thought I knew about humanity's place in the universe. And I realized with a chill that spread from my spine outward that we were not insignificant specks on a minor planet, but rather the focal point of attention from powers and principalities that had been watching and waiting and maneuvering for longer than human civilization had existed. As Zareth stood then, his full height towering over me as he began to pace the cavern with agitated energy, his tail sweeping patterns in the dust that had accumulated over centuries on the stone floor, and he gestured toward the crystalline formations above us that caught and refracted the dim light into rainbow fragments, as if the earth itself was trying to illustrate the prismatic nature of truth, the forces of darkness, the principalities that your apostle Paul warned about in his letter to the Ephesians, are not metaphors or psychological projections or primitive explanations for natural evil, but actual conscious entities operating across dimensions and species, coordinating efforts to capture human souls before they fully awaken to their potential as children of God, he explained. And hearing biblical references from the mouth of a reptilian being who should have been the stuff of nightmares made the reality of spiritual warfare suddenly concrete in ways that 1,000 sermons had never achieved. They have infiltrated your governments, your religions, your entertainment and educational systems, not through crude possession like your movies depict, but through subtle ideological subversion, through promoting philosophies that separate humanity from awareness of the divine, through encouraging you to see yourselves as accidents of chemistry rather than beloved creations, made in the image of the infinite. His words came faster now, tumbling over each other with the urgency of someone trying to download lifetimes of understanding into the limited space of a single conversation, and I found myself standing too, moving closer to hear every syllable as if my life depended on capturing this knowledge before it could evaporate like morning mist under harsh sunlight. But the forces of light, the armies of the living God led by the risen Christ whom my people fear more than any weapon, because he defeated death itself and proved that divine love is the ultimate power in all universes visible and invisible. These forces are also here, working through humans who pray and believe and choose love over fear even when circumstances make fear the logical response. The air in the cavern seemed to thicken around us as Azareth stopped pacing and turned to face me directly, his massive form somehow conveying both terrible danger and profound vulnerability. And when he spoke again, his voice carried harmonics that I felt in my chest as much as heard with my ears, as if the truth he was speaking was resonating at frequencies that bypassed normal sensory processing. To touch something deeper, you ask yourselves why God allows suffering, why evil seems to prosper, why the innocent die while the corrupt thrive. But you do not see that this planet is a battleground where souls are forged and tested and given the opportunity to choose their eternal allegiance through how they respond to circumstances that reveal character more clearly than comfort ever could, he said. And I thought of every tragedy I had witnessed, every loss that had made me question whether a loving God could exist, and suddenly saw those moments through a lens vast enough to contain both divine sovereignty and human free will operating simultaneously. The reason my kind wants to harvest human consciousness is because your souls, when aligned with their Creator, through faith in Christ's redemptive work, become weapons of spiritual warfare capable of shifting the balance of power in conflicts that span galaxies and dimensions beyond your current scientific understanding. He moved closer until I could see my own reflection in his golden eyes, distorted but recognizable, human and fragile, and somehow precious despite my insignificance in the face of cosmic forces beyond my comprehension. Every prayer that ascends from genuine faith creates ripples in the spiritual realm that my people's technology cannot measure, but that they fear desperately, because those prayers invite divine intervention into situations we have carefully controlled. Every act of selfless love performed by humans generates energy that literally pushes back the darkness in ways that our weapons and our genetic engineering and our consciousness transfer technology cannot replicate or defend against. I felt something breaking open inside my chest as Azareth placed his clawed hand over my heart again. And this time, instead of visions of horror, I saw something else entirely. Multitudes of humans throughout history kneeling in prayer, standing firm in faith, choosing forgiveness over vengeance and hope over despair. And from each of these choices I saw light emanating outward like ripples on a pond. Except the pond was reality itself, and the ripples were reshaping the structure of physical and spiritual dimensions simultaneously. This is why the battle for humanity's soul is already underway. Why both darkness and light are fighting for your allegiance. Because you are not the prize in someone else's game, but rather the deciding factor in a war that will determine the fate of consciousness itself across multiple realities. Azareth whispered, his words wrapping around me like a blanket and a warning simultaneously. God has given humanity this power not to make you proud but to make you responsible, not to elevate you above other beings, but to demonstrate to you what love looks like when it operates through surrendered vessels who acknowledge their dependence on their Creator rather than claiming self-sufficient divinity. I understood then with crystalline clarity that the gospel I had heard since childhood was not just a personal salvation message, but a cosmic declaration of war against every force that sought to separate created beings from their source, and that my choice to believe or reject this truth had implications far beyond my individual eternal destiny. The Christ they crucified and who rose again is not merely the Savior of humanity, but the Lord of all creation, the Word through whom everything was made, including my species, before we fell into pride and rebellion. And his victory over death has already sealed the outcome of this war, even though the battles continue until the appointed time when he returns to establish his kingdom in fullness. The sound of helicopter blades cutting through the desert air reached us before the searchlights pierced the cavern entrance, and Azareth moved with sudden urgency that contrasted sharply with the philosophical weight of everything he had just revealed, reaching into a hidden fold in his scaled skin to produce a crystalline device that pulsed with internal light like a beating heart. Made of captured starfire, they have found us more quickly than I anticipated, which means there are traitors within the resistance who still serve the Harvest Council, he said, pressing the device into my trembling hands with a gentleness that seemed impossible from claws that had been designed for combat across worlds I could not name. The object was warm against my palms, humming with energy that seemed to recognize my touch. And as my fingers closed around it, I felt data flooding into my awareness, not as information I read, but as knowledge I suddenly possessed. Locations of underground facilities where human consciousness was being extracted and stored. Names of political and corporate leaders who were either Draco hybrids or human collaborators. Evidence of technologies that could prove to the world that we had never been alone, and that our evolution had been guided and manipulated for purposes that served an agenda written in the stars before our ancestors learned to make fire. This contains everything I have gathered over decades of secretly working against my own kind, proof that will either awaken humanity to the reality of their spiritual and cosmic significance, or get you killed by forces that cannot allow these truths to spread beyond the controlled narrative they have spent centuries constructing. Azareth continued, his golden eyes reflecting the approaching searchlights that now danced across the cavern walls, like probing fingers seeking to expose what should remain hidden. I stood there feeling the weight of the device, as if it contained not just data but destiny itself, the choice crystallizing before me with terrible clarity. I could hide this evidence, bury it in the desert sand, and return to my life pretending that tonight had been a hallucination brought on by stress and isolation, or I could become a messenger of truths that would cost me my anonymity, my safety, my comfortable existence in a world that punished those who spoke about things that challenged the accepted boundaries of reality. The helicopters were directly overhead now, their searchlights turning the cavern entrance into a stage where shadows and illumination fought for dominance. And Azareth placed both his massive hands on my shoulders with a grip that communicated both farewell and commissioning, his face close enough that I could see moisture gathering in those reptilian eyes that should not have been capable of tears but were weeping nonetheless. You must understand that if you choose to reveal what you now know, you will be called insane, a conspiracy theorist, a danger to public order, and those labels will be the least of your concerns because there are forces with technology and resources that make your government agencies look primitive who will seek to silence you permanently, he warned. But even as he spoke of danger, there was something else in his expression, a hope that seemed wildly inappropriate given our circumstances yet absolutely essential to what he was asking me to become. But if you choose to hide, to protect yourself by keeping this knowledge buried, you will live with the awareness that millions of souls are being harvested while humanity sleeps, in ignorance, believing themselves to be alone in a meaningless universe when they are actually the beloved children of the Creator for whom a cosmic war is being waged. I thought of that human prisoner Azareth had described, praying for his captors with genuine love even in the face of horror, and I realized that this was the moment where I would discover what I actually believed, beneath all the cultural Christianity and comfortable theology I had inherited without ever truly testing its weight against real opposition. The device pulsed in my hands like it was alive, like it was waiting for my decision to animate its purpose. And I understood with sudden clarity that this was not about heroism or martyrdom, but about whether I believed that truth spoken in love was more powerful than lies maintained through fear, whether I trusted that the God Azareth claimed had touched his reptilian heart through a human prisoner's prayer was real enough and present enough to protect me through whatever consequences would follow my choice. Azareth stepped back from me then, his form beginning to shimmer, as if he was no longer quite solid, and behind him the air itself seemed to tear open like fabric, revealing light that should not have existed in any spectrum my human eyes were designed to perceive, a portal that defied physics and reason yet somehow felt more real than the stone beneath my feet. Remember what I have told you about the power that resides in human souls aligned with their Creator through Christ. Remember that you are not facing this choice alone even when circumstances make you feel isolated and abandoned. Remember that every prayer you speak with genuine faith creates reverberations across dimensions, where battles are being fought by forces who celebrate every human who chooses truth over comfort, he said, his voice already sounding distant, as if he was speaking from somewhere beyond the cavern, beyond the desert, beyond the earth itself. I wanted to ask him 1,000 questions about where he was going, whether I would see him again, whether there were others like him who had turned against the harvest and were fighting for humanity's awakening. But the words caught in my throat as military voices shouted commands outside and the searchlights found me standing, alone in the center of the cavern holding a crystalline device that glowed with evidence of realities that would shatter the consensus worldview. Your species was created in the image of God, not just in form, but in capacity, the capacity to create, to love, to choose righteousness over pragmatism, to exercise faith that moves mountains both literal and metaphorical across galaxies where mountains exist, that your astronomers have never imagined. Azareth's voice echoed from within the portal of light, and I saw his silhouette framed against illumination that seemed to contain colors for which I had no names, standing between worlds with the posture of someone who had found redemption in the most unlikely place and was now returning to continue a war that had been raging since before time began. The battle for humanity's soul is already underway, and you have just been conscripted not by force but by knowledge, not into slavery, but into the most profound freedom, the freedom to choose sides in a conflict where neutrality is impossible and where your choice will echo into eternities you cannot yet comprehend. The portal collapsed in on itself, with a sound like thunder and singing combined into something that shook the cavern foundations, and suddenly I was alone with the device in my hand, the military voices growing louder outside, the dawn beginning to break over, the desert mountains casting everything in gold and crimson that made the landscape look like it was on fire with divine judgment or divine promise, or perhaps both simultaneously. I looked down at the crystalline object pulsing against my palm, feeling the weight of names and locations and evidence pressing against my consciousness like a responsibility I had never asked for, but somehow always been preparing to receive. And I thought about Jesus standing before Pilate speaking truth to power, even though it cost him everything, about prophets throughout history who spoke words that made them targets because silence would have been complicity with darkness, about that unnamed human prisoner whose prayer of love had cracked open the heart of a reptilian warrior and changed the trajectory of at least one soul in a cosmos full of souls making choices that mattered more than they knew. The helicopters landed outside the cavern entrance, their rotors kicking up dust that turned the dawn light into a haze through which I could see armed figures approaching with weapons drawn and voices demanding my surrender. And I made my choice not with words but with action, sliding the device into my jacket pocket and raising my hands as I walked toward them, knowing that I was walking toward persecution and difficulty and probably death, but also toward something else, toward the truth that I was not a cosmic accident, but a beloved child of the Creator made in His image, and caught up in a war where my faith and my choices mattered across dimensions and distances. That made my fear seem small by comparison. I had been given the terrible, beautiful knowledge that we were never alone, that the battle for humanity's soul was already underway, and that I had been invited to participate not as a victim, but as a warrior armed with the most powerful weapon in all creation, the truth spoken in love by someone who had chosen to believe that God was real, that Christ had conquered death, and that these truths were worth everything I had to give. They took me into custody with zip ties and shouted commands that echoed off canyon walls, still holding the echo of Azareth's departure. And during the 3 days of interrogation that followed in a facility with no windows and no name, I said nothing about what I had seen or what I carried, speaking only when asked direct questions and offering answers so mundane they eventually convinced my interrogators I was simply a security contractor in the wrong place at the wrong time. They searched me twice but never found the device, which had somehow bonded to my body in a way that made it invisible to their scanners and undetectable to their hands. And I understood that I was being protected by forces that operated according to laws my captors did not believe existed. When they finally released me with a non-disclosure agreement and a severance payment that felt like hush money, I drove into the desert at sunrise to the exact place where Azareth had vanished. And there, beneath the sky turning gold with morning light, I knelt in the sand and wept with a combination of terror and gratitude that felt like my heart was being simultaneously broken and remade. The device materialized in my hand as soon as I was alone, and when I touched it with intentionality, rather than fear, it opened not as data on a screen, but as living knowledge that flowed into my mind like water finding its level, showing me not just the locations of underground facilities, but the faces of humans being held there, their souls tethered to bodies that were no longer entirely their own, waiting for someone to speak truth into a world that had been taught to dismiss such truths as fantasy. I spent the next months doing exactly what Azareth knew I would do, not rushing to journalists or posting wild claims on social media, but carefully, prayerfully reaching out to others who had seen things they could not explain, veterans who had witnessed technology that should not exist, intelligence officers whose consciences had been troubled by operations they were ordered not to question, even clergy who had encountered spiritual warfare so tangible it shattered their comfortable theologies and drove them to their knees in desperate prayer. The pattern became clear as I connected with these scattered witnesses. We were not alone in our knowledge, but we had been isolated by design, kept apart so we would each believe ourselves crazy rather than recognizing we were pieces of a testimony that only made sense when assembled together. I began holding small gatherings in homes and church basements, never advertising, always invitation only, sharing not just the information the device contained, but the larger truth that Azareth had entrusted to me, that humanity was beloved by the Creator, that our souls carried divine spark that made us valuable beyond measure, that a cosmic war was being waged for our allegiance, and that Jesus Christ had opened a pathway through His death and resurrection that guaranteed our victory if we would only choose to align ourselves with truth rather than comfortable lies. Some who heard me walked away shaking their heads, unable to integrate what I described with their understanding of reality, but others wept with recognition, saying they had always felt there was more to existence than what they had been taught, that they had sensed invisible battles surrounding their prayers, that encounters with Christ had been too real and too transformative to be dismissed as psychological phenomena. The cost has been exactly what Azareth predicted. I lost my career, my reputation among those who knew me before, my sense of safety in a world where I now recognized the signs of infiltration and manipulation that most people accept as normal. There have been nights when fear wrapped around my chest like chains, and I questioned whether speaking truth was worth the isolation. Moments when I was followed by vehicles with no license plates, and received messages suggesting I should stop talking if I valued my life. Seasons when even my prayers felt like they were hitting a ceiling and bouncing back unanswered. But in those darkest hours, I remember the moisture in Azareth's golden eyes as he spoke of a human prisoner praying for his captors. I remember the warmth of that crystalline device recognizing my touch as if God himself was saying, "I see you, and I have chosen you for this." I remember that Jesus promised his followers would face persecution, not because they were wrong but because truth threatens. Systems built on lies and love challenges structures maintained through fear. And in remembering, I find strength that is not my own, peace that makes no logical sense given my circumstances, and joy that rises from a source deeper than my emotions, from the knowing that I am participating in something eternally significant, that my small yes to truth matters in dimensions where battles rage over every human soul, that the God who created galaxies knows my name and has invited me into partnership with his purposes for a species that was always meant for more than survival. I still have the device, and I still carry its burden of knowledge and responsibility, but I no longer carry it alone, because I have learned what Azareth tried to tell me in that cavern beneath the desert, that faith exercised in community creates a resonance that amplifies across spiritual dimensions, that humans aligned with Christ become conduits for divine power that terrifies forces who have ruled through deception for millennia, that the battle for humanity's soul is already underway, but its outcome was decided on a cross 2,000 years ago, by a God who loved us enough to become one of us and defeat death from the inside. The dawn still breaks over mountains with the same gold and crimson light that illuminated my choice that morning, and every sunrise feels now like a reminder that darkness never gets the final word, that truth spoken in love cannot ultimately be silenced, that we were never alone and never will be, because we are held in the heart of a creator who considers us worth fighting for across distances and dimensions that make our small planet look like a grain of sand on an infinite beach. I do not know how this story ends for me personally, whether I will see Azareth again or whether my testimony will awaken others before I am silenced. But I know with certainty that transcends my doubt that God is real, that Jesus conquered death and opened the way home, that my soul and yours carry divine spark that makes us valuable beyond measure, and that the invitation to choose truth over comfort, love over fear, faith over cynicism is extended to every human being every single day, until the moment when heaven and earth collide and what has been hidden in darkness is finally revealed in light that no shadow can withstand. Have you ever felt like there was more to reality than what you've been told? Like your life was part of a larger story you couldn't quite see? If this testimony stirred something in your spirit, please subscribe so you don't miss what comes next in this journey toward truth.